Raymond of Toulouse, and Adhemar of Lepoy. While advancing into the land of Slavonia, they suffered many losses on the way, especially because it was then winter, for Slavonia was such a desert and so pathless and mountainous that we saw in it neither wild animals nor birds for 3 weeks. The inhabitants of the region were so boorish and rude that they were unwilling to trade with us or to furnish us guidance, but instead fled from their villages and their castles. Indeed, they even butchered like cattle, or, as if they'd done much harm, the feeble aged and the weak poor, who, because of their weakness, followed our army at a distance. But nor was it easy, amid steep mountains and thick woods, for our armed knights to pursue the unarmed brigands, who were acquainted with the country. But they suffered them constantly, unable either to fight or to keep them from fighting. Let us not pass over a certain illustrious act of the Count. When the Count with some of his knights had been hedged about for some little time by the Slavonians, he made a charge upon them, and captured as many as 6 of them. And when on this account the Slavonians pressed him more violently, the Count was compelled to follow the army. He ordered the eyes of some of them, the prisoners, to be torn out, the feet of others cut off, and the nose and hands of still others to be slashed, so that while the pursuers were thus moved at the sight and preoccupied with their sorrow, the Count could safely escape with his companions. And thus, by the grace of God, he was delivered from the straits of death and this difficult situation. Indeed, what courage and wisdom the Count displayed in this region is not easy to relate, for we were in Slavonia for almost 40 days, during which time we encountered clouds so dense that we could feel them and push them before us with a slight movement. Amidst all this, the Count was fighting constantly at the rear and ever defending his people. He was never the first, but always the last to encamp, and though the others went to rest at midday or at the evening, the Count often did so at midnight. At length, through the compassion of God, the labor of the Count, and the advice of the bishop, the army so crossed Slavonia that we lost no one there from hunger, and no one in open battle. On that account, I bear witness, God wanted his army to cross Slavonia, in order that the boorish men who did not know God, upon recognizing the valor and patience of his knights, might either lose something of their wildness, or be brought without excuse to God's judgment. And then, after many labors, we came to the king of the Slavonians at Scutari. The Count swore friendship with him, and gave him a large tribute, so that the army might buy or seek necessaries in security. But this was a vain expectation, for we did penance enough for the peace that we had sought when thereafter the Slavonians, raging in their usual manner, killed our men, and took from the unarmed what they could. We sought not vengeance, but a place of refuge. So much about Slavonia. We came to Durazzo. We believed we were in our own country, thinking that the emperor and his satellites were our brothers and helpmates. They, indeed, raging in the manner of lions, attacked a peaceful people, who thought of nothing less than arms. They butchered them in secret places. They stole what they could by night, in the woods and in the villages from the camps. Although they raged thus, their leader promised peace, but during intervals of peace they killed Pontius Reynald and mortally wounded his brother Peter, and these were the most noble princes. However, when an opportunity was presented to us for revenge, we chose to continue the journey, not to avenge our wrongs. On the way, we had letters from the emperor about peace, brotherhood, and, as I may also say, about alliance. This, however, was a snare in words, for in front and behind, to the right and to the left, Turks and Cumans, Uzi Tanakes, Patzinakes, and Bulgarians were lying in ambush, waiting for us. On a certain day, moreover, when we were in the valley of Pelagonia, the Bishop of Puy, who, in order to find a comfortable resting place, had withdrawn a little distance from the camp, was captured by the Patzinaks. They knocked him down from his mule. They robbed him, beat him severely on the head. But since so great a pontiff was still necessary to the people of God, through God's mercy, he was saved to life. For one of the Patzinaks, in order to obtain gold from him, protected him from the others. Meanwhile, the noise was heard in the camp, and so between the delay of the enemy and the attack of his friends, he was rescued. When we had come amidst the treachery of this fashion to a certain fortress called Buchenat, the Count learned that the Patzinaks intended to attack our army in the passes of a certain mountain. Staying in hiding with some of his knights, he came upon the Patzinaks, and after killing several of them, he turned the rest to flight. Meanwhile, pacifying letters from the emperor reached us, and yet by his evil design the enemy surrounded us on all sides. We came to Thessalonica. The bishop was ill, and remained in the city with a few men. After this, we came to a certain city, Rusa by name, where, since its citizens were plainly disposed to do us evil, our usual patience was somewhat disturbed. And so, taking up arms, we destroyed the outer walls, seized great plunder, and forced the city to surrender. Then, having taken our standards into the city, and shouted Toulouse, which was the battle cry of the Count, we departed. We came to another city, called Rodosto. When knights in the pay of the emperor there sought to carry out his vengeance upon us, many of them were killed, and a quantity of plunder was taken. There, also, the envoys whom we had sent ahead to the emperor came to us, and having received money from him, promised that everything boded well for us with the emperor. What more? The message brought by our envoys and those of the emperor was that the Count, leaving his army behind, should hasten, unarmed, with a few men to the emperor. For they said that Bohemond, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, and other princes made this prayer that the Count should hasten to agree with the emperor about the march to Jerusalem, that the emperor, having taken the cross, should also become leader in the army of God. In addition to this, they reported that the emperor had said that he would make all arrangements with the Count, both about themselves and whatever else should be necessary for the journey. They announced furthermore that a battle was imminent, and that without the support of so great a man, it would be probably unfavorable, and that the Count should therefore go ahead with a few men, so that when his army should arrive, everything would have been arranged with the Emperor, and there would be no delay for anyone. At length, the Count was persuaded to go ahead of his army. In this instance, alone, leaving his guard behind him in the camp, and thus he went, unarmed, to Constantinople. Raymond and Adhemar in Constantinople. Although events have likely accompanied the writer so far with happy and favorable step, they now follow with so great a weight of bitterness and sorrow that it grieves me to have begun what I have vowed to finish. What, indeed, is the most important and first manner that I shall proceed to mention? The most false and detestable deceit of the Emperor's admonition, or the most base flight and unthinkable desperation of our army? Or shall I leave a monument of perpetual sorrow by enumerating the deaths of such great princes? Let anyone who desires to know this, however, seek it rather from others than from me. This one very memorable event I consider to merit excuse from silence. When our men thought of abandoning the camp, taking flight, deserting their fellows, and leaving everything that they had brought along from such distant regions, they were brought back by the saving deeds of penance, and fast to such staunch fortitude that only shame at their former desperate condition and flight most deeply affected them. So much may be said about this. Accordingly, when the Count had been received most honorably by the Emperor and his princes, the Emperor demanded of the Count homage and the oath which the other princes had made to him. The Count replied that he had not come hither to make another his lord, or to fight any other than the one whom he bade left his country and his possessions. Nevertheless, if the Emperor would go to Jerusalem with the army, he would commit himself and his men and all the goods to him. But the Emperor excused himself from the journey by saying that he greatly feared lest the Germans, Hungarians, Cumans, and other wild peoples would devastate his empire if he made the journey with the pilgrims. Meanwhile, the Count, upon bearing of the flight of death of his men, believed that he had been betrayed, and through certain of our princes he had vehemently charged the Emperor with having committed treason. But Alexius said that he did not know that our men had devastated his kingdom, and that B and his men had suffered many injuries, that there was nothing of which the Count could complain, except that while the army of the Count in its usual manner was devastating the villages and towns, it took to flight upon seeing the Emperor's army. Nevertheless, he promised that he would give satisfaction to the Count, and offered Bohemond as a hostage for the satisfaction. They went to trial. The Count, according to law, was compelled to give up his hostage. Meanwhile, our army came to Constantinople, and after this, the bishop, whom the army had left ill at Durazzo, followed us with his brother. Alexius asked homage again, and promised that he would give much to the Count, if he would do him the desired homage as the other princes had done. The Count, however, was constantly meditating how he might avenge the injury to his men and drive away from himself and his followers the disgrace of such great infamy. But the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, and the other princes deprecated such actions, saying that it would be very foolish to fight with Christians when the Turks were threatening. Bohemond, indeed, promised that he would aid the Emperor if the Count made any attempt against the Emperor, or if he no longer refused homage and oath. Thereupon the Count took counsel with his men, and swore that neither in person nor through action would be sully the life and honor of Alexius. And when asked about homage, he replied that he would not do it at the risk of his head, wherefore the Emperor gave him few gifts. Victory at Nicaea. Thereupon we crossed the sea and went to Nicaea, for the Duke, Bohemond, and the other princes had preceded the Count and were engaged in the labors of the siege. The city of Nicaea is very strongly fortified by nature, as well as by art. It has on the west a very large lake flowing up to the wall, and on the remaining 3 sides a moat filled with the overflow of certain little streams. In addition, it is encircled by walls so high that neither the assaults of men nor the attacks of machine are feared. Indeed, the ballistae of the neighboring towers are so turned with reference to one another that no one can approach without danger. However, if anybody wants to approach nearer, he is easily overwhelmed from the top of the towers without being able to retaliate. Accordingly, the city, such as we have described, was besieged by Bohemond from the north, by the Duke of the Alemanni from the east, and by the Count and Bishop of Le Puy from the middle, for the Count of Normandy was not yet with us. But we believed this one incident should not be passed over, that when the Count was about to encamp there with his men, the Turks, descending from the mountains in 2 squadrons, attacked our army. Their plan, indeed, was that while one party of the Turks assailed the Duke and the Alemanni who were on the east, the other party, entering the middle gate of the city and passing out through another, would easily drive our men from the camp, at a time when they were not expecting such an attack. But God, who is wont to reverse the plan of the impious, so altered their preparations that, as if it had been arranged, he sent the Count, who was preparing to encamp with his men upon the squadron of Turks, which was now about to enter the city. He put them to flight at the first charge, and, after killing several, pursued the rest to the top of the mountain. The other party of Turks, which wanted to attack the Alemanni, was put to flight in the same way and destroyed. After this, machines were constructed, and the wall attacked in vain, for it was very firm against us and was valiantly defended by arrows and machine. So we fought 5 weeks with no result. At length, through God's will, some men of the household of the bishop and the Count dangerously enough approached the calmer town which faced the east, and having made a testudo at the tower, they began, after a struggle, to undermine one of the towers, and by digging through it to the ground. Thus the city would have been taken, had not the shadow of night prevented. However, the wall was rebuilt during the night, and this rendered our former labour in vain. At length, the city, terrified with fear, was compelled to surrender. One reason was that the ships of the emperor, which had been dragged over the land and were let down into the lake, they therefore gave themselves up to the emperor, since they now expected no further aid, and saw the army of the Franks increasing daily, while they were cut off from their forces. The Count of Normandy had come. Alexius had promised the princes and the people of the Franks that would be given them all the silver, gold, horses, and goods within the city, and that would be established there a Latin monastery and hospice for the poor Franks. Besides, that would be give to each one of them the army so much of his own possession that they would always want to fight for him. Accordingly, the Franks, placing their faith in these promises, approved the surrender. And so, when Alexius had received the city, he afforded the army such an example of gratitude that, as long as they live, the people will curse him and proclaim him a traitor. We recognize then that the emperor had betrayed Peter the Hermit, who had long before come to Constantinople with a great multitude, for he compelled him, ignorant of the locality and of all military matters, to cross the strait with his men and expose them to the Turks. Moreover, when the Turks from Nicaea saw the unwarlike multitude, they cut them down without effort or delay to the number of 60,000. The rest, indeed, fled to a certain fortified place and escaped the swords of the Turks. But the Turks, made bold and haughty by this, sent the arms and the captives which they had taken there to the Saracens and the nobles of their own race. And they wrote to the peoples and cities far off that the Franks were of no account in battle. The Siege of Antioch. And since, already, in the 3rd month of the siege, food was bought too dearly, Beaumont and the Count of Flanders were chosen to lead an army into Hispania for food, the Count and the Bishop of Puy being left as a guard in the camp. For the Count of Normandy was away at the time, and the Duke was very ill. However, when the enemy learned this, they repeated their customary assaults. The Count, moreover, was compelled to attack them in his usual manner, and after forming the ranks of the foot soldiers, he, with some knights, pursued the assailants. He captured and killed 2 of them on the slope of the little mountain, and forced all the enemy to enter by a bridge. As our foot soldiers saw this, they left their posts and their standards, and ran in a mob up to their bridges. And when there, as if already in safety, they cast stones and weapons upon those who were defending the bridge. The Turks, after forming a long line, began to rush against our men by the bridge and by a path which was lowered down. Meanwhile, our knights chased towards a bridge a certain horse whose master they had overthrown. When our people saw this, thinking our knights in flight, they showed their backs to the enemy without delay. Then the Turks killed without ceasing those who fled. Even if the knights of the Franks wished to resist and fight for their people, they were caught by the crowd of fleeing footmen, by their arms, and by the manes and tails of the horses, and were either thrown from their horses or, out of compassion and regard for the safety of their people, were brought to flight. The enemy, indeed, without delay and without pity, slaughtered and pursued the living, and despoiled the bodies of the dead. Moreover, it was not enough for our men to leave their arms, take flight, despise shame, but they rushed into the river, to be overwhelmed with stones or arrows of the enemy, or to remain under water. If skill and strength in swimming bore anyone across the water, he reached the camp of his companions. However, our flight extended from their bridge to our bridge, and there they killed about 15 of our knights and about 20 foot soldiers. The standard bearer of the bishop was killed there, and his standard was captured. A certain very noble youth, Bernard Raymond of Béziers, also died there. Let the servants of God neither complain or be angry with us, if our men bequeathed such open shame to the memory of our army, since God, who in this way desired to drive to penance the minds of adulterers and robbers, at the same time gladdened our army in Hispania. For a rumour, going forth from our camp, announced to Bohemond and his fellows that all was prosperous, and that the Count had gained a most noble victory. Moreover, this report aroused their spirits no little. After Bohemond had besieged a certain village, we heard some of his peasants suddenly fleeing and shouting. And when he had sent knights to meet him, they saw an army of Turks and Arabs close at hand. Moreover, among those who had set out to determine the cause of the flight and outcry was the Count of Flanders, and with him certain Provençals. For all from Burgundy, Auvergne, Gascony, and all Goths are called Provençals, while the others are called the Frankish race, that is, in the army. Among the enemy, however, all are spoken of as Frankish. Now this Count of Flanders, as we have said, however, thinking it a disgrace to report about the enemy before attacking them, rushed impetuously against the phalanxes of the Turks. The Turks, indeed, unaccustomed to conduct battles with swords, took to flight for refuge. Nor did the Count sheath his sword until he had removed 100 of the enemy from life. When he was now returning to Bohemond as victor, he saw 12,000 Turks coming behind him, and rising up on the nearest hill towards the left, he saw a countless multitude of foot soldiers. Then, after communicating his plan to the rest of the army, he took a number of men back with him, and violently attacked the Turks. Bohemond, indeed, followed at a distance with the rest of the guarded and rear lines, for the Turks have this custom in fighting. Even though they are fewer in number, they always strive to encircle the army. This they attempted to do in this battle also, but by the foresight of Bohemond and the wiles of the enemy were prevented. When, however, the Turks and the Arabs, coming against the Count of Flanders, saw that the affair was not to be conducted at a distance with arrows, but at close quarters with swords, they turned in flight. The Count followed them for 2 miles, and in this space he saw the bodies of the killed lying like bundles of grain reaped in the field. The ambushes which Bohemond had encountered were scattered and put to flight in the same way, but the countless horde of foot soldiers, of which we spoke above, slipped away in flight through the places impassable to horses. I would dare, I say, would it not be arrogant to judge, to place this battle ahead of the fights of the Maccabees, since if Maccabeus with 3,000 felled 48,000 of the enemy, more than 60,000 of the enemy were here turned in flight by a force of 40 knights. I do not, indeed, belittle the valor of the Maccabees, nor exalt the valor of our knights, but I say that God, in marvelous in Maccabeus, was now more marvelous in our troops. A strange result of this achievement was that after the enemy had put to flight, the courage of our men decreased, so that they did not dare to pursue those whom they saw headlong in flight. Accordingly, when the army returned victorious and empty-handed, there was such famine in the camp that 2 solidi were scarcely enough to keep one man in bread for a day, nor were other things to be obtained less dearly. The sufferings of the Crusaders at Antioch. And so the poor began to leave, and many rich who feared poverty. If any for love of valor remained in the camp, they suffered their horses to waste away by daily hunger. Indeed, straw did not abound, and fodder was so dear that 7 or 8 solidi were not sufficient to buy one night's food for a horse. Another calamity also befell the army, for Bohemond, who had become the most distinguished in Hispania, announced that he would leave, that he had come for honor, and now beheld his men and horses perishing for want, and he further said that he was not a rich man, whose private resources would suffice for so long a siege. We found out afterwards that he had said this for the reason that he was ambitiously longing to become the head of the city of Antioch. Well, meanwhile, there was a great earthquake on the 3rd day before the calends of January, and we beheld a very marvelous sign in the sky. For in the first watch of the night the sky was so red in the north that it seemed as if dawn had risen to announce the day. And though, in this way, God chastised his army, so that we were intent upon the light which was rising in the darkness, yet the minds of some were so blind, and they abandoned that they were recalled from neither luxury nor robbery. At this time, the bishop prescribed a fast of 3 days, and urged prayers and alms together with a procession. Upon the people, moreover, he commanded the priests to devote themselves to masses and prayers, the clerics to psalms. Thereupon the merciful Lord, remembering his compassion, put off the punishment of his children, lest the arrogance of their adversaries increase. There was, besides, in our army a certain member of the emperor's household, whom he had given to us in his place, Tatius by name, mangled in nose and all virtue. I had almost forgotten him, since he deserved to be abandoned to oblivion forever. This man, however, was daily whispering in the ears of the princes that they should scatter to the neighboring camp, and then assail the people of Antioch by frequent assaults and ambush. However, as all this was made clear to the Count, for he had been sick since the day when he was forced to flee at the bridge, he called his princes and the Bishop of Puy together. After holding a council, he gave them 50 marks of silver on this condition, truly, that if any of his knights lost a horse, it should be restored to him out of those 50 marks and other resources which had been given to the brotherhood. Moreover, this kind of cooperation was of great profit at the time, since the poor of our army, who wanted to cross the river to gather herbs, feared the frequent assaults of the enemy, and since very rarely did any care to go against the enemy because their horses were starved and weak, and, in addition, so few that scarcely 100 could be found in the whole army of the Count and Bishop. A similar lot had befallen Bohemond and other princes. Accordingly, for this reason, our knights were not afraid to meet the enemy, especially those who had weak horses, since they knew that if they lost their horses, they would simply obtain better ones. Moreover, something else occurred, namely that all the princes except the Count promised the city to Bohemond, provided that it was taken. So Bohemond and the other princes swore to this agreement, that they would not withdraw from the siege of Antioch for 7 years, unless the city was indeed taken. While these matters were happening in the camp, rumor also announced that many of the army of the emperor were coming. It was reported to have been assembled from many peoples, namely Slavs, Patzinaks, and Cumans, along with Turcopoles, for they are called Turcopoles, who either were reared among the Turks or were born of a Turkish father and a Christian mother. These peoples, moreover, because they had hurt us on the march, confessed that they were afraid to meet us. All this, however, that mangled Tatius had made up, and he had made such comments in order to be able to get away. This man, after heaping up not only these statements, but even in the very greatest insults, betrayal of his companions and perjury, slipped away in flight, and having granted to Bohemond 2 or 3 cities, Turso, Mamistra, Adana. Accordingly, after acquiring everlasting shame for himself and his people in this way, he feigned a journey to the army of the emperor, and, leaving his tent and his servants, he set out with the curse of God. It was announced to us at this time that the chief of the caliph was coming to help Antioch with a large army, which he was leading from Khorasan. On this account, after a council had been held in the house of the bishop, it was decided that the foot soldiers should guard the camp, and the knights should go out of the camp against the enemy, for they said that if the many unwarlike and fearful in our army saw a multitude of Turks, they would afford examples of fright rather than boldness. Our men, therefore, set forth at night, lest those in the city should notice their departure, and report it to those who were coming to aid them, and hid themselves among the little mountains about 2 leagues distant from our camp. However, when it became morning, the enemy appeared with the sun. Let them hearken, I beg. Who have at one time and another tried to hurt the army, so that when they recognize the God enlarges his compassion among us, that they may hasten to make restitution by lamentations of penance. Accordingly, after the knights had been formed in 6 squadrons, God multiplied them so much that they who had scarcely seemed to number 70 before the formation, after it were sworn to number more than 2,000 in each squadron. What, indeed, shall I say of their boldness? When the knights even sang the military songs so festively that they regarded the coming battle as if it were a game. Moreover, the battle happened to be fought in this place where the swamp and river are a mile apart. This, however, prevented the enemy from spreading out, so that they could not encircle us in their usual manner. For God, who had given us other things, afforded us 6 successive valleys for advancing to battle. In 1 hour after going forth, the field was taken, and while the sun shone brightly, the battle was committed to arms and shields. Our men, moreover, at first advanced a little, while the Turks, though they scattered to shoot with their bows, yet made a move to retreat. But our men suffered very much until the first ranks of the Turks were pushed into the rear, for as we learned from their deserters, there were said to be not less than 28,000 horsemen in this battle. And when the first line of the Turks was sufficiently mixed up with the following lines, the Franks called upon the Lord and charged. Nor was there delay. The Lord, strong and mighty in battle, was present. He protected his children and hurled down the enemy. So the Franks pursued them, even to their strongly fortified camp, which was about 10 miles from the place of battle. But the custodians of the camp, upon seeing this, set fire to it and fled. We were, however, so rejoiced and exultant at this, that we hailed as a second victory the burning of the camp. And thus, on the same day, the light in the camp was so great that there was no place toward the city where fighting was not going on, for the enemy had arranged that, while we are most fiercely engaged by the besieged, we should be overwhelmed by their unexpected aid from the rear. But God, who granted victory to our knights, fought among our foot soldiers also. And on that day we obtained no less a triumph over the besieged than our knights reported over our helpers. Accordingly, after the victory and the spoils had been won, the several heads of the dead were brought to the camp, and that we might cause fear among the enemy by evidence of the fate of the scattered allies, the heads had been brought along, were suspended on stakes. This we believed later to have been done by the disposition of God. For when the standards of the Blessed Mary had been captured, they put it point downward to the ground, as if to shame us. And thus it happened that they were restrained from taunting us by the sight of the uplifted heads of their men. At this time, there were in our camp envoys from the king of Babylon, who, upon seeing the wonders which God was working through his servants, glorified Jesus, the Son of the Virgin Mary, who through his poor had ground to dust the mightiest tyrants. These envoys, moreover, promised us favor and goodwill with their king. Besides, they told us of very many good deeds with their king toward the Egyptian Christians and our pilgrims. Thereupon our envoys were sent back with them to enter upon a treaty and friendship with the king. The fall of Antioch. Meanwhile, messengers began to come very frequently, saying that aid was coming to the enemy. Moreover, this report came to us not only from the Armenians and Greeks, but was also announced to us by those who were in the city. When the Turks had obtained Antioch 14 years prior, they had converted Armenians and Greek youths as if for want of servants, and had given them wives. When such men as these had a chance to escape, they came to us with horses and arms. And when this report became frequent, many of our men and the Armenian merchants began to flee in terror. Meanwhile, good knights who were scattered among the fortresses came and bought arms, fitted and repaired them, and when the gradually lessening swelling of pride had flowed from our army, and courage, ever ready to undergo dangers with brothers and forebrothers, had come in its place, one of the converted who was in the city sent word to our princes through Bohemond that would be surrendering the city to us. Accordingly, when the plan had been communicated, the princes sent Bohemond and the Duke of Lorraine and the Count of Flanders to try it out. And when they had come to the hill of the city at midnight, an intermediary sent back by him who was surrendering the city had said, "Wait until the light passes." For 3 or 4 men went along the walls of the city with lamps all night, arousing and admonishing the watchers. After this, however, our men approached the wall, raised a ladder, and began to ascend. A certain Frank, Fulger by name, the brother of Boudeles of Chartres, was the first boldly to ascend the wall. The Count of Flanders, following, sent word to Bohemond and the Duke to ascend, and since all hurried, each to go ahead of the other, the ladder was broken. But those who had climbed up went down into the city and opened a certain little postern. Thus our men went in, and they did not take captive of any of those whom they found. When the dawn appeared, they shouted out. The whole city was disturbed, and the women and small children began to weep. Those who were in the castle of the Count, aroused at this outcry, since they were nearer it, began to say to one another, "Their aid has come." Others, however, replied, "That does not sound like the voice of joyful people." And when the day whitened, our standards appeared on the southern hill of the city, and when the disturbed citizens saw our men on the mountain above them, some fled through the gate, others hurled themselves headlong. No one resisted. In truth, the Lord had confounded them. Then after a long time, a joyful spectacle was made for us, in that those who had so long defended Antioch against us were now unable to flee from Antioch. Even if some of them had dared to take flight, yet they could not escape death. A certain incident occurred there, joyful and delightful enough for us. For when some Turks strove to flee among the cliffs which divide the Bill in two from the north, they encountered some of our men, and when the Turks were forced to go back, the repulsed fugitives went with such rapidity that they all fell over the precipice together. Our joy over the fallen enemy was great, but we grieved over the more than 30 horses who had their necks broken there. How great were the spoils captured in Antioch, it is impossible for us to say, except that you may believe as much as you wish, and then add to it. Moreover, we cannot say how many Turks and Saracens then perished. It is furthermore cruel to explain by what diverse and various deaths they died. When those foes who guarded the castle in the middle of the hill saw the destruction of their men, and that our men were refraining from besieging them, they kept their castle. Gracianus, however, who had gone out by a certain postern, was captured and beheaded by some Armenian peasants, and his head was brought to us. This, I believe, was done by the ineffable disposition of God, that he who had caused many men of his same race to be beheaded should be deprived of his head by them. The city of Antioch was captured on the 3rd day before the nones of June. It had been besieged, however, since about the 11th day before the calends of November. Kerboga's attack. In the meantime, while our men, engaged in counting and identifying their spoils, had desisted from the siege of the upper fortress, and while listening to the pagan dancing girls, had feasted in splendor and magnificence, not at all mindful of God who had granted them so great a blessing, they were besieged by pagans on the 3rd day, and the nones of the same June. And so it was brought about that they who by the mercy of God had so long besieged the Turks in Antioch were through his disposition in turn besieged by the Turks, and that we might be the more fearful, the upper fortress, which is a kind of citadel, was in the hands of the enemy. Our men, accordingly, under the stress of fear, took up the siege of the fortress. Kerboga, however, the lord of the Turks, expecting the battle to take place there, fixed his tents at a distance of about 2 miles from the city, and, with ranks arrayed, came up to the bridge of the city. Our men, however, had strengthened the fortress of the Count on the 1st day, fearing that if they proceeded to battle, it would be seized by the enemy who were in the citadel, or if they deserted the fortress which was before the bridge and the enemy occupied it, that the enemy would shut us off from a chance to fight and block our exit. There was, in the army, a knight of most distinguished and very dear to all, Roger of Barneville by name, who, while pursuing the army of the retiring enemy, was captured and deprived of his head. Fear and grief, accordingly, assailed our men, so that many were led to the desperate hope of flight. Thereupon, when the Turks had once again suffered a repulse in fighting, they besieged the fortress on the 3rd day, and the fighting was carried out there with such violence that the might of God alone was believed to defend the fortress and resist adversaries. For when the Turks were already prepared to cross the moat and destroy the walls, they were taken with fright, I know not why, and rushed headlong into flight. Then, seeing no reason for their flight, they returned to the siege, only after they had run a short distance, blaming their own timidity, and as if to atone for the disgrace of the flight they had made, they attacked more violently, and again were more violently terrified by the might of God. Therefore the enemy returned to their camp on that day. On the next day, however, they returned to the fortress with a very great supply of siege machinery, but our men set fire to the fortress and thrust themselves within the walls of the city. And thus, as the fear of the Franks was increased, the boldness of the enemy grew. Forsooth, we had nothing outside the city, and the fortress, which was the head of the city, was held by our foes. The Turks, emboldened by this, arranged to enter us by the fortress. Our men, however, relying on their favorable and lofty location, fought against the enemy, and at the very first attack, overthrew them. But forgetful of the threatening battle and intent upon plunder, they in turn were most vilely put to flight. For more than 100 men were suffocated in the gate of the city, and even more horses. Then the Turks, who had entered the fortress, wanted to go down into the city, for the valley between our mountain and their fortress was not large, and in the middle of it was a certain cistern and a little level place. Nor did the enemy have a path down into the city except through our mountain, wherefore they strove with every intent and all their might to drive us out and remove us from their path. The battle was waged with such force, from morning to evening, that nothing like it was ever heard of. There was a certain frightful and as yet unheard of calamity that befell us, from amidst the hails of arrows and rocks, and the constant charge of javelins, and the deaths so many, our men became unconscious. If you ask for the end of this fight, it was night. The discovery of the Holy Lance. And so, as we said, when our men were in panic, and while they were on the verge of despair, divine mercy was at hand for them, and that mercy which had corrected the children when they were wanton, consoled them when they were very sad, in the following way. Thus, when the city of Antioch had been captured, the Lord, employing his power and kindness, chose a certain poor peasant, Provençal by race, through whom he comforted us, and he sent us these words to the Count and Bishop of Puy. Andrew, Apostle of God, and of our Lord Jesus Christ, has recently admonished me a 4th time, and has commanded me to come to you and give it back to you after the city was captured. The lance which opened the side of the Saviour. Today, moreover, when I had set out from the city with the rest to battle, and when caught between 2 horsemen, I was almost suffocated on the retreat. I sat down sadly upon a certain rock, almost lifeless. When I was reeling like a woe-begone from fear and grief, Saint Andrew came to me with a companion, and he threatened me much unless I returned the lance to you quickly. And when the Count and Bishop asked him to tell in order the apostolic revelation and command, he replied, At first, the earthquake which occurred at Antioch when the army of the Franks was besieging it, such fear assailed me that I could say nothing except God help me, for it was night and I was lying down, nor was there anyone else in my hut to sustain me by his presence. When moreover the shaking of the earth had lasted a long time, my fear had ever increased. 2 men stood before me in the brightest raiment. The one was older, with red and white hair, black eyes, and a kindly face, his beard indeed white, wide and thick, his stature medium, but the other was younger and taller, handsome in form beyond the children of men. And the older said to me, What doest thou? And I was very greatly frightened, because I knew that there was no one present. And I answered, Who art thou? He replied, Rise and fear not, and heed what I have to say to thee. I am Andrew the Apostle, Bring together the Bishop of Puy, and the Count of St. Giles, and Peter Raymond of Hauteport, and say these words to them. Why has the bishop neglected to preach and admonish, and daily to sign his people with the cross, which he bears before them? For it would profit them much. And he added, Come, and I will show thee the lance of our Father, Jesus Christ, which thou shalt give to the Count, for God has granted it to him ever since he was born. I arose, therefore, and I followed him into the city, dressed in nothing except a shirt. And he led me into the church of the Apostle of St. Peter through the north gate, before which the Saracens had built a mosque. In the church, indeed, were 2 lamps, which were there gave as much light as if the sun had illuminated it. And he said to me, Wait here, and he commanded me to sit upon a column, which was closest to the stars, by which one ascends to the altar from the south. But his companion stood at a distance before the altar steps. And then St. Andrew, going underground, brought forth the lance, and gave it into my hands. And he said to me, Behold the lance which opened his side, whence the salvation of the whole world has come. While I held it in my hands, weeping for joy, I said to him, Lord, if it is thy will, I will take it and give it to the Count. And he said to me, Not now, for it will happen that the city will be taken. Then come with 12 men, and seek it here whence I draw it forth and where I hide it. And he hid it. After these things had been so done, he led me back over to the wall to my home, and so they left me. Then I thought to myself of the condition of the poverty of your greatness, and I feared to approach you. After this, when I had set forth for food to a certain fortress which is near Edessa, at the first day of Lent in the morning, St. Andrew appeared to me in the same garb, and with the same companion with whom he had before, and a great blindness filled the house. And St. Andrew said, Art thou awake? Thus aroused, I replied, No, my lord. Am I not asleep? And he said to me, Hast thou told these things which I bade thee tell some time ago? And I answered, Lord, have I not prayed thee to send someone else to them? For fearful of my poverty, I hesitated to go before them. And he said, Dost thou know not why the Lord led you hither? And how much he loves you, and why he chose you especially? He made you come hither to rebuke contempt of him, and to avenge his people. He loves you so dearly, that the saints already at rest, foreknowing the grace of divine arrangements, wished that they were in the flesh, and struggling along with you. God has chosen you from all peoples, as grains of wheat are gathered from the oats, for you excel in favor and rewards all who may come before or after you, just as gold excels silver in value. After this they withdrew, and such illness oppressed me that I was about to lose the light of my eyes, and I was arranging to dispose of my very meagre belongings. Then I began to meditate that these things had justly befallen me because of my neglect of the apostolic command. Thus comforted, I returned to the siege. Thinking again of the handicap of my poverty, I began to fear that if I went to you, you would say that I was a serf, and was telling this for the sake of food. Therefore I was silent instead, and thus in the course of time, when at the port of St. Simeon on Palm Sunday, I was laying down in my tent with my lord, William Peter, St. Andrew appeared with a companion, clad in the same habit in which he had come before, bespoke thus to me: "Why hast thou not told the count and bishop and the others what I have commanded thee?" And I answered, "Lord, have I not prayed to send another in my place who would be wiser, and to whom they would listen? Besides, the Turks are along the way, and they kill those who come and go." And St. Andrew said, "Fear not, they will harm thee not. Say also to the Count not to dip in the river Jordan when he comes there, but to cross in a boat. Moreover, when he has crossed, dressed in a linen shirt and breeches, let him be sprinkled from the river, and after his garments are dry, let him lay them away and keep them with the lance of the Lord." And this, my lord, William Peter, heard, though he did not see the apostle. Thus comforted, I returned to the army, and when I wanted to tell you this, I could not bring you together. And so I set out to the port of Mamistra. There, indeed, when I was about to sail on the island of Cyprus for food, St. Andrew threatened me much if I did not quickly return to you and tell you what had been commanded of me. And when I thought to myself how I would return to the camp, for that port was 3 days distant from the camp, I began to weep most bitterly, since I could find no way of returning. At length, admonished by my lord and my companions, we entered the ship and began to row to Cyprus. And although we were borne along all day by oar and favouring winds up to sunset, a storm then suddenly arose, and in the space of 1 or 2 hours we returned to the port which we had left. And thus, checked from crossing a second and third time, we returned to the island at the port of St. Simeon. There I fell seriously ill. However, when the city was taken, I came to you. And now, if it please you, test what I say. The bishop, however, thought it nothing except words, but the count believed it, and handed over the man that had said this to the chaplain Raymond to guard. Our Lord jest. Christ appeared on the very night which followed to a certain priest named Stephen, who was weeping for the death of himself and his companions, which he expected there. For some who came down from the fortress frightened him, saying that the Turks were already descending from the mountain into the city, and that our men were fleeing and had been defeated. For this reason, the priest, wishing to have God witness of his death, went into the church of the Blessed Mary in the garb of confession, and after obtaining pardon, began to sing psalms with some companions. While the rest were sleeping, and while he watched alone, after having said, Lord, who shall dwell in tabernacle, or who shall rest in thy holy hill? A certain man stood before him, beautiful beyond all, and said to him, Man, who are these people who have entered the city? The priest answered, Christians. Christians of what kind? Christians who believe that Christ was born of a virgin and suffered on the cross, died and was buried, and that he arose on the 3rd day and ascended into heaven. And that man said, And if they are Christians, why do they fear the multitude of pagans? And he added, Dost thou not know me? The priest replied, I do not know thee, but I see that thou art most beautiful of all. And then the man said, Look at me closely. And when the priest intently scrutinized him, he saw a kind of cross, much brighter than the sun, proceeding from his head. And the priest said to the man who was questioning him, Lord, we say that they are the images of Jesus Christ, which present a form like thine. The Lord said to him, Thou hast said well, since I am he. Is it not written of me that I am the Lord, strong and mighty in battle? And who is the Lord in the army? Lord, replied the priest, I hear never was in the army but one Lord. For rather do they put trust in the bishop. And the Lord said, Say this to the bishop, that these people who have put me are far from them by evil doing, and let them speak to them as follows. The Lord says this, Return to me, and I will return to you. And when they enter battle, let them say this, Our enemy are assembled and glory in their own bravery. Destroy their might, Lord, and scatter them, so that they may know that there is no other who will fight for us except thee, O Lord. And say this also to them, If ye do whatever I command you, even for 5 days, I will have mercy upon you. Moreover, while he was saying this, a woman of countenance radiant beyond measure approached, and upon gazing at the Lord said, Lord, what art thou saying to this man? And the Lord said to her, I am asking him about these people who have entered the city, who they are. And the lady replied, Oh, my lord, these are the people for whom I entreat thee so much. And when the priest shook his companion who was sleeping near him, so that he might have a witness of so great a vision, they had disappeared already from his eyes. However, when morning came, the priest climbed the bill opposite the castle of the Turks, where our princes were staying, all except the duke, who was guarding the castle on the north hill. And thus, after assembling a gathering, he told these words to our princes, and, in order to show that it was true, he swore upon the cross. Moreover, wishing to satisfy the incredulous, he was willing to pass through fire, or jump from the top of the tower. Then the princes swore that they would neither flee from Antioch nor go out, except with the common consent of all, for the people at this time thought that the princes wanted to flee the fort. And thus many were comforted, since in the past night there were few who stood steadfast in the faith and did not wish to flee. And had not the bishop and Bohemond shut the gates of the city, very few would have remained. Nevertheless, William of Grandmesnil fled, and his brother, among many others, cleric and lay. It befell many, however, that when they had escaped from the city with the greatest danger, they faced the greater danger of death at the hands of the Turks themselves. At this very time, many things were revealed to us through our brethren, and we beheld a marvelous sign in the sky, for during the night there stood over the city a very large star, which, after a short time, divided into 3 parts, and fell into the camp of the Turks. Our men, somewhat comforted, accordingly awaited the 5th day, which the priest had mentioned. On that day, moreover, after necessary preparation, and after everyone had been sent out of the church of St. Peter, 12 men, together with that man who had spoken of the lance, began to dig. There were, moreover, among these 12 men, the Bishop of Orange, and Raymond, chaplain of the Count, who has written this, and the Count himself, and the Pontius of Balazon, and Feraldus of Tours. And after we had dug, from morning to evening, some began to find despair of finding the lance. The Count left, because he had to guard the castle, but in place of him and the rest who were tired of digging, we induced others, who were fresh, to continue the work sturdily. The youth who had spoken of the lance, however, upon seeing us worn out, disrobed, and taking off his shoes, descended into the pit in his shirt, earnestly entreating us to pray to God to give his lance to the comfort and victory of his people. At length, the Lord was minded through the grace of his mercy to show us the lance, and I, who have written this, kissed it when the point alone had as yet to be appeared above the ground. What great joy and exultation then filled the city! I can't describe it. Moreover, the lance was found on the 18th day before the calends of July. On the 2nd night, St. Andrew appeared to the youth through whom he had given the lance to us, and said to him, "Behold, God has given to the Count that which he never wished to give to anyone, and has made him standard-bearer of this army, as long he shall continue in his love." When the youth asked mercy from him for the people, St. Andrew replied to him that verily would the Lord show mercy to them. And again, when he asked the same saint about his companion, who it was he held so often seen with him, St. Andrew answered, "Draw near and kiss his foot." And so, when he was about to draw near, he saw a wound on his foot, as fresh and bloody as if it had just been made. When, however, he hesitated to draw near because of the wound and blood, St. Andrew said to him, "Behold, the Father who was wounded on the cross for us, whence this wound. The Lord likewise commends that you celebrate that day on which he gave you his lance. And since it was found at the Vespers, and that day cannot be celebrated, celebrate the solemn festival on the 8th day in the following week, and then each year on the day of the finding of the lance. Say also to them that they conduct themselves as is taught in the epistle of my brother Peter, which is read today. And his epistle was this: Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Let the clerics sing this hymn before the lance. Lustra sexcigiam per acta tempus implens corporis. And when they shall have said, Agnus in cruce levatus, immolandus stipite, let them finish the hymn on bended knees. When, however, the Bishop of Orange and I, after this, asked Peter Bartholomew if he knew letters, he replied, I do not, thinking that if he were to say, I do, we would not believe him. He did know a little, But at that hour he was so ignorant that he neither knew letters nor had remembrance of any of the things he had learned from letters, except the Paternoster, Credo in Deum, Magnificat Glory in Excelsis Deo and Benedictus Dominus Deus Israel. He had lost the others, as if he had never learned them at all, and though he was able afterwards to recover a few, it was with the greatest effort. The defeat of Kerboga. As we have said, when our men were beaten, discouraged, and in narrow straits, divine aid appeared, and the blessed Saint Andrew taught us through the youth that had spoken of the lance how we ought to conduct ourselves before the battle and in the battle. You have all offended deeply, and you have been deeply humbled, and you have cried out to the Lord. The Lord has heard you. And now let each one turn himself to the Lord because of his sins, and let him give 5 alms because of 5 wounds of the Lord. If he cannot do this, let him say the Paternoster 5 times. When this has been done, begin battle in the name of the Lord by day or by night, as the judgment of princes deems best, because the hand of God will be with you. If anyone has doubt of victory, let the gates be opened for him, and let him go forth to the Turks, and he will see how their God will save him. Moreover, if anyone shall refuse to fight, let him be classed with Jude, the betrayer of the Lord, who deserted his apostles and sold his Lord to the Jews. Let him fight in the faith of St. Peter, holding in mind that God promised him that after the 3rd day he would arise and appear to him, and for this reason, also because his land is justly St. Peter's, and not the pagans. And let your battle cry be, God help us. And verily, God will help you. All your brothers who died since the beginning of the expedition are present with you in this fight. You have only to storm the 10th part of the enemy, because they will assail 9 parts in the fight, and command of God. And do not put off the battle, because if you do, the Lord will lead as many enemies from the other sides as you have on this side, and he will keep you shut up here until you devour one another. But know certainly that those days are at hand which the Lord promised to the Blessed Mary and his apostles, saying that he would raise up the kingdom of the Christians after the kingdom of the pagans had been cast down and ground to dust. But do not turn their tents in search of gold and silver. And then the power of God was disclosed, in that he who had commanded above the words to be preached to us through his apostles so comforted the hearts of all that each one in faith and hope seemed himself already to have triumphed over the enemy. They urged on one another, and in urging regained courage for the fight. The crowd, too, which in the past days seemed to be consumed with want and fright, now reproached the princes and complained of the delay of battle. However, when the day for the battle had been fixed, our princes sent word by Peter the Hermit to Koboba, leader of the Turks, to give up the siege of the city, because it was right by the property of St. Peter and the Christians. The proud leader replied that, rightly or wrongly, he was going to rule over the Franks and the city. And we compelled Peter the Hermit, who was unwilling to bow, to kneel to him. The question was raised at this time as to who should guard the city against those who were in the citadel, while the rest went forth to fight. They built a stone wall and ramparts on our hilt against the enemy. These they fortified with many rocks, finally leaving Count Raymond, who was deathly ill, and about 200 men there. The day of the fight had come. In the morning, all partook of communion and gave themselves to God, to death, if he willed, or to the glory of the Roman Church and the race of the Franks. Moreover, they decided about the battle as follows. The 2 double lines should be made of the count and bishop's people, so that the foot soldiers went before the knights and halted at the command of the princes, and the knights were to follow them and guard them from the rear. Similar arrangements were made of the people of Bohemond and Tancred, and like the people of the Count of Normandy and the Franks likewise, of the people of the Duke of the Burgundians. Moreover, trumpeters went through the city, shouting out that each man should stay with the princes of his people. It was likewise ordered that Hugh the Great, the Count of Flanders, and the Count of Normandy should advance to the battle first, then the Duke, the Bishop after the Duke, and Bohemond after the Bishop. Thus they assembled, each man to his own standard and kinfolk, within the city before the gate of the bridge. Oh, how blessed is the people whose Lord is God! Oh, how blessed the people whom God has chosen! Oh, how unaltered his face! How changed from the army, from sadness to eagerness! Indeed, during the past days, princes and nobles went along the city, streets calling upon the aid of God at the churches. The common people walked with bare feet, weeping and striking at their breast. They had been so sad that the father did not greet son, nor brother greet brother upon meeting, nor did they look back. But now you could see them going forth like swift horses, rattling their arms and brandishing their spears, nor could they bear to refrain from showing their happiness in word and deed. But why do I grieve about many matters? They were given the powers to go forth, and what had been agreed upon by the princes was fulfilled in order. Meanwhile, Kobara, the leader of the Turks, was playing chess within his tent when he received the message that the Franks were advancing to battle. He was disturbed in mind, because this had seemed beyond expectation, and he called to him a certain Turk who had fled from Antioch, Myrdalin by name, a noble known to us for his military skills. "What is this?" he said. "Didn't you tell me that the Franks were few and would not fight with us?" And Myrdalin replied to him, "I did not say that they would not fight, but come, and I will look at them and tell you if you can easily overcome them." And now the 3rd line of our men was advancing. When he saw the lines were arrayed, Myrdalin said to Kobara, "These men can be killed, but they cannot be put to flight." He replied, "Can none of them be driven back at all?" And Myrdalin replied, "They will not yield a footstep, even if all the people of the pagans attack them." And then Although disturbed in mind, he drew up his many and multiple lines against us. And when at first they could have prevented our exit, they allowed us to go out in peace. Our men, however, now directed their lines toward the mountains, fearing that the Turks might surround them from the rear. However, the mountains were about 2 miles long from the bridge. We were advancing in open file, as the clergy are wont to march in processions, and verily we had a procession. For the priests and many monks, dressed in white robes, went in front of the lines of our knights, chanting and invoking the aid of our Lord and the benediction of the saints. The enemy, on the contrary, rushed against us and shot arrows. Kaboga, now ready to do what he had just recently refused, likewise sent word to our princes, proposing that 5 or 10 Turks should do battle with a like number of Franks, and that those whose knights were conquered should peacefully yield to the others. To this, our leaders replied, "You were unwilling when we wanted to do this. Now that we have advanced to fight, let each fight for his right." And when we had occupied the whole plain, as we said, a certain portion of the Turks remained behind us and attacked some of our foot soldiers. But those soldiers turning about sustained the attack of the enemy with vigor. When indeed the Turks could go in no way to drive them out, they set fire around them, so that those who did not fear the swords might at all events be terrified by fire. And thus they forced them to give way, for the place had much dry hay. When the lines had gone forth, the priests, with bare feet, and garbed their priestly vestments, stood on the walls of the city, calling upon God to defend his people, and through the victory of the Franks in this battle to afford a testimony hallowed by his blood. Moreover, as we were advancing from the bridge up to the mountain, we met with great difficulty, because the enemy had mind to surround us. In the midst of this, the lines of the enemy fell upon us, who were in the squadron of the bishop. And though their forces were greater than ours, yet though the protection of the Holy Lance was still there, they were wounded no one. Neither did they hit us with any arrows. I beheld these things which I speak and bore the lance of our Lord there. If anyone says that Viscount Heracus, the standard-bearer of the bishop, was wounded in battle, let him know that he handed over his standard to another and fell behind our line some distance. When all our fighting men had left the city, 5 other lines appeared among us. For as has already been said, our princes had drawn up only 8, and we were 13 lines outside the city. In the beginning of the march out to battle, the Lord sent down upon all his army a divine shower, little but full of blessing. All those touched by this were filled with grace and fortitude, and despising the enemy, rode forth, as if always nourished on the delicacies of kings. This miracle also affected our horses no less, for whose horse failed in the fight was over, even though it had tasted nothing except the bark or leaves of trees for 8 days. God so multiplied our army that we, who before seemed so fewer than the enemy, were in battle more numerous than they. And when our men had thus advanced and formed in line, the enemy turned in flight, without giving us a chance to engage in the battle. Our men pursued them until sunset. There the Lord worked marvelously as well in the horses as in the men. Forsooth, the men were not called away from the battle by avarice, and those pack horses which their masters had led into battle after a scant feeding were now very easily followed the sleekest and swiftest horses of the Turks. But the Lord did not wish us to have this joy only, for the Turks who were guarding the citadel of the city gave up hope after seeing the headlong flight of their people. Some, on the pledge of their lives alone, surrendered themselves unto us, and the rest fled headlong. And though this battle was so terrible and frightful, yet few knights of the enemy fell there, but of their foot soldiers scarcely any escaped. Moreover, all the tents of the enemy were captured, much gold, much silver, and the greatest amount of spoils, grain and cattle and camels, without measure or number. And that incident of Samaria, about the measures of wheat and barley which were bought for a shekel, was renewed for us moreover. These events occurred on the vigils of St. Peter and Paul, through which intercessors was granted this victory to the pilgrim church of the Franks by the Lord Jesus Christ, who liveth and reigneth God through all ages. Amen. The march to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Count and the other princes inquired of the inhabitants of that region how the march to Jerusalem might be better and more easily made. For there are mountains of Lebanon, in which almost 60,000 Christian men dwell. The Christians who were near the city of Tyre, now commonly called Sur, whence they are called Syrians, have possessed that land and the mountains for a long time. But when the Saracens and the Turks arose through the judgment of God, those Syrians were in such great oppression for 400 and more years that many of them were forced to abandon their fatherland and the Christian law. If, however, any of them, through the grace of God, refused, they were compelled to give up their beautiful children to be circumcised, or converted to Mohammedanism, or they were snatched from the lap of their mothers after the father had been killed and the mother mocked. Forsooth, the race of men were inflamed to such malice that they overturned the churches of God and his saints, or destroyed his images, and they tore out the eyes of those images, which for lack of time they could not destroy, and shot them with arrows. All the altars, too, they undermined. Moreover, they made mosques of the great churches, but if any of those distressed Christians wished to have an image of God, or any saint in his home, he either redeemed it month by month, or year by year, or it was thrown down into the dirt and broken before his eyes. In addition, too harsh to relate, they placed youths in brothels, and, to do yet more vilely, exchanged their sisters for wine. And their mothers dared not weep openly at these or other sorrows. Why do we say much about them? Surely that people had conspired against the Holy of Holies and his inheritance. Except by command and direction of God, the people of the Franks would have encountered these ills, had not God straightway armed brute animals against the enemy, as he did once in our presence. And so much for this. When those Syrians, who, we have said as above, came to the Count, were asked about their better route, they replied, "The way through Damascus is level and full of victuals, but you will not find water for 2 days. The other way through the mountains of Lebanon That's safe enough and well watered, but is very bad for the pack animals and camels. There is another way, along the sea, where there are so many and such narrow passes that if 50 or 100 Saracens want to hold them, they could do so against all mankind. And yet it is contained in the Gospel of St. Peter, which we have, that if you are the people who are to take to Jerusalem, you will pass along the sea coast, though because of the difficulty it seems impossible to us. Moreover, there is written that in the Gospel among us not only what you have done, but also what you ought to do about it, this march and many other things. While some were urging in this and other ways, and others were contradicting, William Hugo of Montel returned with the cross of which we spoke. Moreover, when the friends of the Count likewise beheld the cross, they became so eager for the march, that except for the counsel of the Count and the other princes, the servants of the Count would have burned their beds and been the first to leave the siege of Arrebas. Thereupon the Count was disturbed to tears, and even hatred of himself and his people. But the Duke of Lorraine especially wished this journey and admonished the people to it. Accordingly, having set forth from that detestable and hateful siege of Arcas, we came before Tripoli. Even then, Count Raymond with prayers and gifts urged all the nobles to besiege the city of Tripoli, but they all opposed him. At this time, St. Andrew appeared to Peter Desiderius, of whom we have made mention, and said to him, "Go and speak to the Count," saying, "Do not molest thyself or others, for unless Jerusalem shall first have been taken, thou shalt have no help. Do not trouble thyself about the unfinished siege of Arcas. Let it not weigh upon thee in this city, or others which are on the journey are not taken at present, because a fight will soon come upon thee in which these and many other cities shall be captured. Furthermore, do not trouble thyself or thy men, but distribute freely in his name whatever God shall grant to thee, and be a companion and loyal friend to your vassals. If thou shalt do this, God will grant thee Jerusalem, and Alexandria, and Babylon. But if thou dost not do this, thou shalt neither acquire these things promised by God, nor have a message until thou art placed in such straits that thou knowest not how to escape." So the Count accepted the words of the priest. He accepted them truly, in words, but he refused them in deeds. For when he had received great wealth from the king of Tripoli, he was never willing to give anyone any of it, but be even daily afflicted by his people with blows and insults. Not only this, however, did the priest tell us, but also many other things, some of which we have added to this work. For once, when we wanted to set out from Antioch, that priest came to me, Raymond, and said to me that a certain person had appeared to him in a vision, and had said, "Go into the church of Saint Leontius, and thou wilt find there the relics of 4 saints. Take them with thee, and carry them to Jerusalem." And he showed him that in the vision that the relics and locations of these relics, and he taught him the names of the saints. When the priest had awakened, not fully believing in his vision, he began to urge God with prayers and entreaties to make known to him a second time, if this vision was from him. Several days later, the same saint stood before him in a vision and threatened him much because he had neglected the command of God, and said that, unless he had taken those relics away by the 5th day of the week, it would be a great hurt to him and his lord, Count Isard. Isard, the Count of Die, was a man loyal to God, as far as he knew, and helpful to all of us for his wisdom and uprightness. When the priest had narrated this to me, Raymond, I told it to the Bishop of Orange and the Count of St. Giles and to some others. We took candles, and we went to the church of St. Leontius. We offered the candles and vows to God, and to saints of the same church, praying that Almighty God, who had sanctified them, might give them as companions and helpers, and that those saints might not spurn the company of pilgrims and exiles for God, but rather out of the charity might link us with God. When it became morning, we went with the priest to the places where the relics were kept, and we found everything just as it had been foretold. Moreover, these are the names of the saints: Cyprian, Omechios, Leontius, and John Chrysostom. And furthermore, at the place where the relics were kept, we found a little chest filled with more. When we asked a priest about these, of which saint they were the relics of, he replied that he did not know. But when we inquired of the inhabitants if they knew which saint these were the relics of, some said of Saint Mercurius, others, however, of other saints. But the priest wished to take them and put them in the collection of other relics. To him, I, Raymond, said angrily in the presence of all who were there, "If this saint wishes to come with us to Jerusalem, let him make known his name and wish, otherwise let him remain here. Why should we weigh ourselves with unknown bones and carry them along?" Wherefore on the day those relics were left behind. But when the priest had collected the other relics and rolled them up into clothes and a covering, on the night which followed, as he lay awake, there appeared to him a youth of about 15 years, exceedingly beautiful, who said to him, "Why didst thou this day not take any relics with the rest?" The priest replied, "Who art thou?" "Dost thou not know who is the standard-bearer of this army?" he replied. The priest answered, I do not, sire." When the priest had made the same reply to the same questions a second time, the youth threatened the priest terribly, saying, "Tell me the truth." And then the priest said, "Sire, it is said of St. George, that is the standard-bearer of this army." He replied, "Thou hast said well. I am he. Take therefore relics and put them with the others." When, however, the priest had been deferred doing this for several days, the same St. George came to him and commanded the priest sternly, saying, "Do not delay longer than the morning to take up my relics, and nearby in a little ampoule thou wilt find some of the blood of the Virgin and martyr St. Thecla, which likewise take, and after this chant Mass." And the priest found all this, and so did it. But before we go on to the remainder, we ought not to pass over these men who did not hesitate, for the love of the most holy expedition, to sail through the unknown and very long water of the Mediterranean and the ocean. For when the angels beard the name of the Lord's vengeance against those who unworthily occupied the birthplace of Christ and his apostles, they embarked upon the Anglican Sea, rounding Spain, crossing the ocean, and thus ploughing through the Mediterranean Sea. With great labour, they gained the port of Antioch and the city of Laodicea before our army came thither by land. Their ships, as well as those of the Genoese, were of advantage to us at this time, for during the siege we had trade with the island of Cyprus, and the remaining islands because of these ships and the security which they offered. Forsooth, these ships passed daily over the seas, and for this reason the ships of the Greeks were safe, since the Saracens feared to encounter them. But when the Angles saw the army setting forth for Jerusalem, and that the strength of their own ships was impaired by the long wait, for they had 30 ships in the beginning, but now had scarcely 9 or 10, some abandoned their ships or exposed them. However, others burned theirs or hastened with us on the journey. When our princes were entangled in delay before Tripoli, the Lord sent such great desire of going to Jerusalem that no one there could restrain themselves, or another, but setting out at evening against all the decrees of the princes, and at the custom of our army, we walked along all that night, and came on the following day to Beirut. After this, when the narrow passages which are called the Twisted Mouth had been suddenly seized in advance, we came in a few days, and without baggage, to Acre. The king of Acre, however, afraid that we would besiege his city, and hoping that we would withdraw, took oath to the count that if we captured Jerusalem, or were in the region of Judea for 20 days, and the king of Babylon did not meet us in battle, or if we were able to overcome that king, he would surrender himself and his city to us, but that in the meanwhile he would be our friend. Setting forth from Acre, one day at vespers, we pitched camp by the swamps which are near Caesarea. And meanwhile, according to custom, some ran here and there below the camp, as need demanded, and while others were inquiring from acquaintances, while their companions were lodged, a dove mortally wounded by a hawk fell down in the midst of those running about. When the bishop of Agde took it up, he found a letter which it was carrying, and the sense of the letter was as follows. The king of Acre to the Duke of Caesarea. A canine breed, a foolish and troublesome host without order passed me. As you love your law, try by yourselves and through others to hurt them. This you can do easily to them if you wish. Send this likewise to other cities and fortresses. In the morning, when we were commanding the army to rest, the letter was shown to the princes and to all the people, and it was manifest how God had been kind to us, so that not even the birds could cross through the air to harm us, and that he likewise disclosed to us the secrets of the enemy. Wherefore we rendered praise and thanks to Almighty God, and then setting forth securely and willingly, we went forward, frequently in the front rank of the army, and also at the end. But when the Saracens who lived in Ramla heard that we had crossed the river nearby, they left their fortifications and arms, and much grain in the fields and crops which we gathered. And when we came to it on the next day that we found that God was truly fighting for us, so we offered vows to St. George, because he had confessed himself our guide. The leaders and all the people agreed that we should there choose a bishop, since that was the first church on which we found in the land of Israel, and also in the order that St. George might entreat God on our behalf, and might, of course, lead us faithfully through in the land of which he was not worshipped. Moreover, Ramla is about 15 miles from Jerusalem. Therefore, we held conference. Some said, "Let us not go to Jerusalem at present, but towards Egypt. We will obtain not only Jerusalem, but likewise Alexandria and Babylon and very many kingdoms. If we go to Jerusalem and, failing of sufficient water, give up the siege, we will accomplish neither this nor the other afterward." But others said in opposition, "There are scarcely 1,500 knights in this army, and the number of armed men is not great. And yet it is now suggested that if we go to very distant and unknown regions, where we will be able neither to get help from our people nor a place to garrison in a city, if we capture one, nor even if it should be necessary, we would be able to return thence. But none of this. Let us hold to our way, and let God provide for his servants, for the siege, for thirst, for hunger, and for other things." Accordingly, after leaving a garrison in the fortress of Ramla with the new bishop, we loaded our camels and oxen, and then all of our baggage, animals, and horses, and turned to march to Jerusalem. However, the word which Peter Bartholomew had commanded us, that we should not approach Jerusalem except with bare feet, we forgot, and we held in low regard, each one from ambition to occupy castles and villas, wishing to go ahead of the next. For it was a custom among us that if any one came to a castle or villa first and placed his standard with a guard, it was touched by no one else after. Therefore, because of this ambition, they arose at midnight, and without waiting for companions, gained all those mountains and villas which are in the meadows of the Jordan. A few, however, to whom the command of God was more precious, walked with naked feet, and sighed heavily for the contempt of the divine word, and yet no one recalled a companion or friend that ambitious chase. Moreover, when by such arrogant procedure we had come near Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem came forth to meet the first of our men, and wounded the horses severely. Of those men, 3 or 4 fell on that day, and many were wounded. The fall of Jerusalem. Duke Godfrey and the Count of Flanders and the Count of Normandy besieged the city from the north side, that is, from the church of St. Stephen, located at the center of the city, southward to the angular tower next to the Tower of David. Count Raymond and his army, however, settled down on the west and besieged Jerusalem from the camp of the Duke to the foot of Mount Zion. But since his men could not come close to besiege the wall because of a gully which intervened, the Count wished to move his camp and change his position. One day, while he was reconnoitering, he came to Mount Zion and saw the church which is located on the mount. When he heard the miracles that God had performed there, he said to his leaders and companions, "If we neglect to take this sacred offering, which the Lord has so graciously offered us, and the Saracens there occupy this place, what will become of us? What, if through hatred of us they shall destroy and pollute these sacred things? Who knows that God may not be giving us this opportunity to test our regard for him? I know this one thing for certain. Unless we carefully protect this sacred spot, the Lord will not give us the others within the city." And so, Count Raymond, against the wishes of the leaders of his army, ordered his tents to be moved to that spot. As a result of this, he incurred such great hatred from his men that they were neither willing to encamp with him nor do the guard duty during the night. Each stayed where he had first pitched his tent, with the exception of a few who accompanied the Count. However, by great rewards, the Count daily induced knights and footmen to guard his camp. There are, in that church, these sacred treasures, the tombs of the kings David and Solomon, as well as that of the first martyr St. Stephen. There the Blessed Mary departed from this world. The Lord supped there, and after rising from the dead, appeared there to his disciples and to Thomas. On this spot also the disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit. Thereupon, when the siege had been set, it happened one day that some of the leaders of the army met a hermit on the Mount of Olives, who said to them, "If you attack the city tomorrow in the 9th hour, the Lord will deliver it into your hands." They replied, "But we do not have the necessary machinery for storming the walls." The hermit responded, "God is all-powerful. If he wills, he will storm the walls even with one ladder. The Lord aids those who labor for the truth." So, with such machinery as could be constructed during the night, an attack was made on the city in the early morning, and it lasted until the 3rd hour. The Saracens were compelled to retreat behind their inner walls, for the outer wall was broken down by our men, some of whom even climbed to the top of the inner walls. Now when the city was about to be captured, in the confusion of desire and fear of the attack was interrupted, and we then lost many men. On the next day, no attack was attempted. After this, the whole army scattered throughout the surrounding country to collect provisions, and nothing was even said of the necessity of preparing the machines that were needed to capture the city. Each man was serving his mouth and stomach. What was worse, they did not even ask the Lord to free them from such great manifold evils, and they were afflicted even unto death. Just before our arrival, the Saracens had filled up the springs, destroyed the cisterns, and dammed up the brooks from the springs. And the Lord himself had turned rivers into wilderness, and water springs into thirsty ground for the wickedness of them that dwell therein. Therefore, water was obtained with great difficulty. Now there is a fountain at the foot of Mount Zion, which is called the Pool of Siloam. Indeed, it is a large spring, but the water flows forth only once in 3 days, and the natives say that formerly it emptied itself only on Saturdays. The rest of the week it remains stagnant. We do not know how to explain this, except that the Lord willed it to be so. But when, as we have said, the water did flow on the 3rd day, it was consummate with such great crowding and haste that men pushed one another into it, and many baggage and animals perished. And so, when the pool was filled with the crowd with the bodies of the dead animals, the stronger, even at the price of death, forced their way to the very opening of the rocks through which the water flowed, while the weak got only the water which had been already contaminated. Many sick people fell down by the fountain, with tongues so parched that they were unable to utter a word, with open mouths that stretched forth from their hands toward those who had water. In the field were many horses, mules, cattle, and sheep, most of the animals without strength enough to move, and when they had become parched and died because of extreme thirst, they rotted where they had long stood, and there was a most sickening stench throughout the camp, Because of such affliction it was necessary to fetch water a distance of 2 or 3 leagues, also to drive the cattle to distant watering places. When the Saracens noticed that our people were going unarmed to the watering places through the dangerous passes in the hills, they lay in wait for them in ambush. They killed many and drove away the flocks and herds. The situation was so bad that anyone brought foul water to the camp in vessels. He was able to get any price he cared to ask, and if anyone wished to get clear water, for 5 or 6 numbers he could obtain enough to satisfy his thirst for a single day. Wine, moreover, was never, or very rarely even mentioned. In addition, the heat, the dust, and the wind increased their thirst, as though this was not bad enough in itself. But why say so much about these troubles? None or few were mindful of the Lord, or of such work was needed to capture the city, nor did they take heed to beseech the Lord's favor, and thus would not recognize God in the midst of our affliction, nor did he show favor to the ungrateful. Meanwhile, messengers came to camp, announcing that our ships had arrived at Joppa, and the sailors demanded that a guard be sent to hold the tower of Joppa to give them protection for the port, for the town of Joppa had been destroyed, except the castle, and that was nearly in ruins, with the exception of a single tower. However, there is a harbour there, and it is the one nearest to Jerusalem, being about only 1 day's journey distant. All of our people rejoiced when they heard the news of the ships, and they sent out Count Galdemar, surnamed Calpinellus, accompanied by 20 knights and about 50 men on foot. Later they sent Raymond Pilatus with 50 knights, and William of Sabran with his followers. As Galdemar and his contingent approached the plains that on his side of Ramallah, they encountered a force of 400 chosen Arabs and about 200 Turks. Galdemar, because of the small number of his men, arranged his knights and bowmen in front ranks, and, trusting in the Lord, advanced upon the enemy without hesitation. The enemy, however, thought that they would be able to crush this band, and, rushing upon them and shooting arrows, they encircled them. 3 or 4 of Galdemar's knights were killed, including Achard of Montmerle, a noble youth and renowned knight. Others were wounded, and all of the bowmen fell. However, many of the enemy were also killed. Nevertheless, the attack of the enemy did not slacken on account of all this, nor did the courage of our knights, nay, God's knights, falter. Though oppressed by wounds and death itself, they stood up to their enemies all the more fiercely, and the more they suffered from them, the more they stood. When our leaders, rather from weariness than from fear, were about to withdraw, a cloud of dust was seen approaching. Raymond Pilatus was rushing headlong into the fight with his men. However, his men raised so much dust that the enemy thought that there were many knights with him, and thus by the grace of God our men were delivered. The enemy scattered and fled. About 200 of them were killed, and much plunder was taken. It is the custom of this people, when they flee and are hard pressed by the enemy, first to throw away their arms, and then their clothes, and lastly their saddlebags. Thus it happened in this flight that our few knights continued killing the enemy until they were worn out, and they kept the spoils obtained from the rest, even of those whom they did not kill. After the pursuit was over, our men assembled, divided the spoils, and then marched to Joppa. The sailors received them with great joy, and felt so secure after the arrival that they forgot their ships and neglected to place watches on the sea, but entertained the Crusaders with a feast of bread, wine, and fish from the ship's supplies. The sailors, careless of their security, failed to post lookouts for the night, and in the darkness were suddenly surrounded by enemies from the sea. When dawn came, they realized that the enemy was too strong to be resisted, and they abandoned their ships, carrying only the spoils. Thus our knights returned to Jerusalem after winning one battle and losing another. However, one of our ships, which had gone on a plundering expedition, was not captured. It was returning to port with the greatest plunder when it saw the rest of our ships surrounded by so great a fleet of the enemy. By the use of oars and sail, it made its escape to Laodicea, and told our friends and companions at the port what had happened at Jerusalem. We knew that we had deserved this misfortune, for we had refused to place faith in the words sent to us by the Lord. Despairing of God's mercy, the men went to the plain of the river Jordan, collected palms, and were baptized in its waters. They did so chiefly with the intention of abandoning the siege, having seen Jerusalem, and of going to Joppa, thence to return home by whatever means they could. But the Lord looked after the ships for his unfaithful. About this time, a public assembly was held, but leaders of the army were quarreling with each other. There was a dissatisfaction, because Tancred had occupied Bethlehem, and had placed his standard over the Church of the Nativity, as though it was an ordinary house. An effort was also made to elect one of the princes king to have custody of the city, lest what had been achieved in common should be destroyed in common for want of anyone to take care of the city if God should give it to us. The bishops and clergy replied to this suggestion. You ought not to choose a king where the Lord suffered and was crowned. For if a David, degenerate in faith and virtue, should say in his heart, I sit upon the throne of David and hold his kingdom, the Lord would probably destroy him and be angry with place and people. Besides, the prophet proclaims, saying, When the Holy of Holies shall come, unction shall cease, because it will be manifest to all peoples that he has come. But when there should be an advocate to guard the city, and divide the tributes and rents of the region among the guardians of the city, for this and many other reasons, the election was stopped and put off until the 8th day after the capture of Jerusalem. And not in this matter alone, but in other ways our affairs did not prosper, and the troubles of the people increased every day. Nevertheless, the merciful and propitious Lord, both of his namesake and lest our enemies should insult his law and say, Where is their God? Sent word to us through the Bishop of Puy, Lord Adhemar, how we could placate his anger and obtain his mercy. We, however, preach that this be done without mentioning the command of God, lest if the people transgress this command of the God, they should be especially afflicted, that they would then be the more culpable. For the Lord was so kind to us that he had sent his messengers so often, but because they were our brothers, we had not heeded them. The bishop, Adhemar, appeared before Peter Desiderius, saying, Speak to the princes and all the people, and say to them, You who have come from distant lands to worship God and the Lord of hosts, purge yourselves of your uncleanliness, and let each other turn from his evil ways. Then, with bare feet, march around Jerusalem invoking God, and you must also fast. If you do this, and then you make a great attack on the city in the 9th day, it will be captured. But if you do not, all the evils that you have suffered will be multiplied by the Lord. When the priest had said this to William Hugo, the brother of the bishop, to his lord Count Isard, and to a certain of the clergy, they assembled the princes and the people and addressed them. Brothers, do you know why we undertook this expedition, and what we have suffered, and that we are acting negligently, in that we are not constructing the machines that are needed to capture the city? Likewise, we are not careful to reconcile Thy Lord to us. For we offend him in many ways, and through our evil deeds we have driven him from us. Now, if it seems right to let you each become reconciled to his brother whom he has offended, and let brother graciously forgive brother. After this, let us humble ourselves before God. Let us march around Jerusalem in bare feet, and, through the patronage of the saints, invoke the mercy of the Lord, so that Almighty God, who fears for us, his servants, laid aside his form for his Godhead, assumed the flesh, and humbly rode into the city on a donkey to suffer death on the cross for our sins, may come to our aid. If we make this procession around the walls, for the honor and glory of his name, he will open the city to us, and give us judgment upon his enemies and ours, who now, with unjust possession, contaminate the place of his suffering and burial, the enemy who seek to deny us the great blessing of the place of God's humiliation and our redemption. These words were pleasing to both the princes and the people, and it was publicly commanded that on the next Friday the clergy should lead the procession with crosses and relics of the saints, while the knights and all able-bodied men with trumpets, standards, and arms should follow them, bare-footed. All this we did according to the commands of God and the princes. When we reached the spot of the Mount of Olives, whence the Lord had ascended into heaven after the resurrection, the following exhortation was made to the people. Now that we are on the very spot from which the Lord made his ascension, and we can do nothing more to purify ourselves, let each one of us forgive his brother whom he has injured, that the Lord may forgive us. What more? All were reconciled to each other, and with generous offerings we besought the mercy of God, that he should now not desert his people, whom he had led so gloriously and miraculously to his goal. And thus the mercy of God was obtained, since everything that had been against us was now favorable. Although we had passed over many matters, this one we ought to record. While we marched around the city, the Saracens and Turks made the circuit on the walls, procession, ridiculing us in many ways. They placed many crosses on the walls in yokes, and mocked them with blows and insulting deeds. We, in turn, hoping to obtain the aid of God in storming the city by means of these signs, pressed the work of the siege, day and night. The Frankish victory. Later, all of our people went to the sepulchre of our Lord, rejoicing and weeping for joy, and they rendered up the offering that they owed. In the morning, some of our men cautiously ascended to the roof of the temple and attacked the Saracens, both men and women, beheading them with naked swords. The remainder sought death by jumping down into the temple. When Tancred heard of this, he was filled with anger. The Duke and the Counts of Normandy and Flanders placed Gaston of Bert in charge of the workmen who constructed machines. They built mantlets and towers with which to attack the wall. The direction of this work was assigned to Gaston by the princes because he was a most noble lord, respected by all his skill and reputation. He very cleverly hastened matters by dividing the work. The princes busied themselves with obtaining the material, while Gaston supervised the construction. Likewise, Count Raymond made William Riccau superintendent of the work on Mount Zion, and placed the Bishop of Albara in charge of the Saracens and others who brought in the timber. The Count's men had taken many Saracen castles and villages and forced them to work as though they were their serfs. Thus, for the construction of the machines at Jerusalem, 50 or 60 men carried on their shoulders a great beam that could not have been dragged by 4 pair of oxen. What more shall I say? All worked with a singleness of purpose. No one was slothful, and no bands were idle. All worked without wages, except the artisans, who were paid from a collection taken from the people. However, Count Raymond paid his workmen from his own treasury. Surely the band of the Lord was with us and aided those who were working. When our efforts were ended and the machines completed, the princes held a council and announced, "Let all prepare themselves for a battle on Thursday. In the meantime, let us pray, fast, and give alms. Hand over your animals and your boys to the artisans and carpenters, that they may bring in beams, poles, stakes, and branches to make mantlets. 2 knights should make 1 mantlet and 1 scaling ladder. Do not hesitate to work for our Lord, for your labors will soon be ended." This was willingly done by all. Then it was decided what part of the city each leader should attack, and where his machines should be located. Meanwhile, the Saracens in the city, noting the great number of machines that we had constructed, strengthened the weaker parts of the wall, so that it seemed that they could be taken only by the most desperate of efforts. Because the Saracens had made so many and such strong fortifications to oppose our machines, the Duke, the Count of Flanders, and the Count of Normandy spent the night the day before to set the attack for the moving their machines, mantlets, and platforms to that side of the city, which is between the church of St. Stephen and the valley of Josaphat. You who read this must not think that this was a light undertaking, for the machines were carried in parts almost a mile to the place where they were to be set up. When the morning came, and the Saracens saw that all of the machinery and tents had been moved during the night, they were amazed. Not only the Saracens were astonished, but our people as well, for they recognized that the band of the Lord was with us. The change was made because the new point was chosen for attack was more level, and thus suitable for moving the machines up to the walls, which cannot be done unless the ground is level, and also because the part of the city seemed to be weaker, having remaining unfortified, as it was some distance from our camp. This part of the city is on the north side. Count Raymond and his men worked equally hard on Mount Zion, but They had much assistance from William Embriaco and the Genoese sailors, who, although they had lost their ships at Joppa, as we have already related, had been able nevertheless to save ropes, mallets, spikes, axes, and hatchets, which were very necessary to us. But why delay the story? The appointed day arrived and the attack began. However, I want to say first that according to our estimates and many others, there were 60,000 fighting men within the city, not counting the women and those unable to bear arms, and there were not many of these. At the most, we did not have more than 12,000 able to bear arms, for there were many poor people and many sick. There were 12 or 1,300 knights in our army, as I reckon it, not more. I say this that you may realize that nothing, whether great or small, which is undertaken in the name of the Lord can fail, as the following pages will tell. Our men began to undermine the towers and walls. From every side stones were hurled from the tormenti and petrae, so that many arrows that they fell like hail. The servants bore this patiently, sustained by the premises of their faith, whether they should be killed or should presently prevail over their enemies. But the battle showed no indication of victory, until the machines were drawn nearer to the walls. They hurled not only stones and arrows, but also burning wood and straw. The wood was dipped in pitch, wax, and sulphur. Then straw and tow were fastened on an iron brand, and when lighted, these firebrands were shot from the machines. They were all bound together by an iron band. I say that so wherever they fell, the whole mass held together and continued to burn. Such missiles, burning as they shot upward, could not be resisted by swords or by high walls. It was not even possible for the defenders to find safety from behind their walls. And thus the fight continued, from the rising to the setting sun, in which splendid fashion that it is difficult to believe anything more glorious was ever done. Then we called on Almighty God, our leader and guide, confident in his mercy. The night brought fear to both sides. The Saracens feared that we would take the city during the night or on the next day, for the outer works were broken through, and the ditch was filled, so that it was possible to make an entrance through the wall very quickly. On our part, we feared that only the Saracens would set fire to the machines that were moved close to the wall, and thus improve their situation. And so on both sides, it was a night of watchfulness, labor, and sleepless caution. On one side, most certain hope, and on the other, a doubtful fear. We gladly labored to capture the city for the glory of God. They less willingly strove to resist our efforts for the sake of the laws of Mohammed. It is hard to believe how great were the efforts made on both sides during the night. When the morning came, our men eagerly rushed to the walls and dragged the machines forward, but the Saracens had constructed so many machines that for each one of ours they now had 9 or 10. Thus they greatly interfered with our efforts. This was the 9th day, on which the priest had said we would capture the city. Our machines were now shaken apart by the blows of many stones, and our men lagged because they were very weary. However, they remained the mercy of the Lord, which is never overcome nor conquered, but is always a source of support, even in times of such adversity. One incident must not be omitted. 2 women tried to bewitch one of the hurling machines, but a stone struck and crushed them, as well as 3 slaves, so that their lives were extinguished and the evil incantations averted. By noon, our men were greatly discouraged. They were tired and at the end of their resources. There were still many of the enemy opposing each one of our men. The walls were very high and strong, and the great resources and skill the enemy exhibited in repairing their defenses seemed too great for us to overcome. But while we hesitated, irresolute, and the enemy exulted in our discomfort, the healing mercy of God inspired us and turned our sorrow into joy, for the Lord did not forsake us. While a council was being held to decide whether or not our machines should be withdrawn, for some were burned and the rest badly shaken, a knight on the Mount of Olives began to wave his shield to those who were with the Count and others, signaling them to advance. Who was this knight? We do not know. We have been unable to find out. But at this signal, our men began to take heart, and some began to batter down the wall, while others began to ascend by means of scaling ladders and ropes. Our arrows shot burning firebrands, and in this way checked the attack that the Saracens were making upon the wooden towers of the Duke and the 2 Counts. These firebrands, moreover, were wrapped in cotton. This shower of fire drove the defenders from the walls, and then the Count quickly released the long drawbridge which had protected the side of the wooden tower next to the wall, and it swung open from the top, being fastened to the middle of the tower, making a bridge over which the men began to enter Jerusalem, bravely and fearlessly. Among those who entered, first were Tancred and the Duke of Lorraine, and the amount of blood that they shed on the day was incredible. All ascended after them, and the Saracens now began to suffer. Strange to relate, however, at this very time when the city was practically captured by the Franks, the Saracens were still fighting on the other side, where the Count was attacking the wall, as though the city should never be captured. But now that our men had possession of the walls and towers, wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men, and this was more merciful, cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows, so they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses, but these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, a place where religious services are ordinarily chanted. What happened there? If I tell the truth, it will exceed your powers of belief. So let it suffice to say this much, at least that in the temple and the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was just a splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood. Some of the enemy took refuge in the Tower of David, and, petitioning Count Raymond for protection, surrendered the tower into his hands. Now that the city was taken, it was well worth all our previous labors and hardships to see the devotion of the pilgrims at the Holy Sepulchre, for they rejoiced and exulted and sang a new song to the Lord, for their hearts offered prayers of praise to God, victorious and triumphant, which cannot be told in words. A new day, a new joy, new and perpetual gladness. The consummation of our labor and devotion drew forth from all new words and new songs. This day, I say, will be famous in all future ages, for it turned our labors and sorrows into joy and exultation. This day, I say, marks the justification of all Christianity, the humiliation of pagans, and the renewal of our faith. This is the day which the Lord Bath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it, for on this day the Lord revealed himself to his people and blessed them. On this day, the Ides of July, Lord Adhemar, Bishop of Puy, was seen in the city by many people. Many also testified that he was the first to scale the wall, and that he summoned the knights and people to follow him. On this day, moreover, the apostles were cast forth from Jerusalem and scattered over the whole world. On this same day, the children of the apostles regained the city and fatherland of God and the fathers. On this day, the Ides of July shall be celebrated to praise and glory the name of God, who, in answering the prayers of his church, gave in trust and benediction to his children and the city and fatherland which he had been promised to the fathers. On this day, we chanted the office of the resurrection, since on that day he, who by his virtue arose from the dead, revived us through his grace. So much is to be said of this. The vision of peace. Accordingly, after 6 or 7 days, the princes solemnly began to consider the matter of choosing a ruler, who, assuming charge of all matters, should collect the tributes of the region, to whom the peasants of the land could turn, and whom to see that the land was not further devastated. While this was taking place, some of the clergy assembled and said to the princes, "We approve your election, but if you proceed rightly and properly, you will choose a spiritual vicar, as eternal matters come before temporal, after this a ruler to preside over secular matters. Otherwise we shall hold invalid whatever you do." The princes were exceedingly angered when they heard this, and proceeded the more quickly with the election. The clergy had been weakened by the departure of Lord Adhemar, the Pontiff of Puy, who in his life had held our army together with holy deeds and words, like a second Moses. After him, however, William, Bishop of Orange, a man of good repute, wished to minister to our strength, but he rested in peace at Mara within a short time. Accordingly, therefore, the good men having been taken off, the clergy conducted themselves humbly, all except Bishop of Albara and some others. However, the Bishop of Martirano, advancing by other than the right road, since he had obtained the church of Bethlehem by fraud, was captured by the Saracens on the 3rd or 4th day, and never again appeared among us. The princes, disregarding admonition and opposition, urged the Count of St. Giles to accept the kingdom. But he said that lie abhorred the name of the king that city, though he would consent to have others accept it. For this reason, they together chose the Duke, and placed him in charge of the sepulchre of the Lord. After this, however, the Duke required the Tower of David from the Count, but the latter refused, saying that he wished to stay in that region until Easter, and meanwhile he wanted to keep himself and his men in honourable state. But the Duke said that he would give up other places rather than the Tower. and so the disputes were multiplied. The counts of Flanders and Normandy favoured the Duke, and almost all land from the Count of Raymond did likewise, in the belief that the tower was surrendered, he would thereupon return home. Not alone did the Provençals oppose their lord, the Count, in this matter. They also made up many vile statements about him, so that he would not be chosen king. And so the Count, without the help of companions or friends, handed over the tower to the Bishop of Albara for the sake of avoiding judgment. But the latter, without waiting for judgment, handed it over to the Duke, and when he was called traitor for having done this, he said that he had been compelled to do so, and had suffered violence. I found this out, in truth, that very many arms were brought into the house of the Patriarch, where the bishop was staying near the Holy Sepulchre. But he spoke also of violence done himself, and often secretly charged the friends of the Count with this affair. And so, when the tower had been surrendered, the Count blazed forth into great anger against his people, saying that he could not remain disgraced in that country. Accordingly, we set out from Jerusalem to Jericho, took palms and went to the Jordan. There, as Peter Bartholomew had commanded, a raft was constructed from twigs, and with the Count on it, we pulled it across the river. Since, till this time, we had no ship, this plan seemed better to us. When after this the multitude had been called together, we commanded that they pray for God, the life of the Count and the other princes. Therefore we proceeded to dress only in a shirt and new breeches, as we had been commanded about baptism. But why the man of God so commanded, we still do not know. When these matters had been accomplished, we returned to Jerusalem. At this time, Arnulf, chaplain of the Count of Normandy, was chosen by the Patriarch. By some, the good clergy opposing it, not only because he was a subdeacon, but especially because he was of priestly birth, and was accused of incontinence on our expedition, so much that they shamelessly composed vulgar songs about him and the matter. But, led on by such ambition, and disregarding the decrees and canons and infamy of his birth and conscience, he stirred up the people against the good clergy, and had himself raised upon the patriarchal seat with hymns and chants, and the great applause of the people. The divine vengeance exacted from the Bishop of Maritano, who had been instigator and executor of this affair, not only did not terrify Arnulf, but furthermore did not prevent him from depriving of their benefices the clergy who had altars in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or those in whose custody indulgence funds had been established. And thus Arnulf, increasing his power, began to inquire from the inhabitants of the city where the cross was which pilgrims had been accustomed to adore before Jerusalem was taken. Although they denied this knowledge, and by oath and other signs were willing to show that they did not know, they were at length compelled to yield. And they said this: "It is manifest that God has chosen you, has delivered you from all tribulation, and has given you figs in many other cities, not by the strength of your valor, but by blinding the impious in his wrath. Your Lord and Guide has opened to you the most strongly fortified cities and has won fearful battles for you. Therefore, why should we stubbornly conceal from you his good gifts, since we see that God is with you?" After this, They led him to a certain hall in the church, and, unearthing the cross, they gave it up. Therefore, our men rejoiced, and we returned praise and thanks to Almighty God, who not only gave us the city in which he had suffered, but likewise the symbols of his passion and victory, that we might more closely embrace him with the arms of faith, the more certain the signs of our salvation that we beheld. Thank you very much. That is the end of the account. Wasn't that interesting? I hope you enjoyed it. Plenty more primary source accounts to come. I like them. They're good fun. Now, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons, as I'm very tired finishing up this one. It's been a long day. That is, a big thanks to Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Fizarbo, Legitmus, Christine, and Maverick. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I hope I'll see you back here tomorrow. Good night and lots of love to you all.